So let's set that up.
So as it always starts, Kale and I are chatting, and then we start getting on topic, and it's like, dang it, we better start recording because we're chatting about personal stuff, and personal stuff sort of leads to uh,
The good
uh
stuff, the good stuff,
the
Paul.
good stuff, the good
Yeah.
stuff. So, so we were talking, we were just talking about, Kale asked about my church, and I was talking about the fact that I remember seeing a study a number of years ago where two religious communities were highlighted by the fact of broad sacrificial giving,
Mm.
and it was a particular Jewish community, and it was the Christian Reformed Church, where you had a tradition of serious Christian formation at a young age, and we're talking about how that is going away. And then Kale just mentioned Italian Catholics and Irish Catholic immigrants to the United States who probably had a very similar pattern, and which sort of brings us around to I guess, the ostensible topic of this, even though, of course, in Harry Potter, I only know the movies, but
Mhm.
yeah, it was pretty obvious to see that the visiting professor of defense against the dark arts, that wasn't exactly the character in the movie you wanted to be.
Right. Yeah, it meant that you had a one film contract, really. I mean, let's be honest. Because and all the focus, of course, it makes a certain amount of sense, defense against the dark arts, especially, which I do, Grimm, of course, sort of has invoked this from the beginning. But I think that there's a real insight to that because if you look at the role that the dark arts play, not only just in the Hogwarts world but in the larger sphere in Harry Potter. And again, just to nerd out here just for a second, just so we can fit it in a situation and maybe then abstract out into our world. That the defensive against the dark arts is sort of in this sleepwalking phase because Voldemort has been gone for 10 years. And so in that 10 years, there's been a kind of letting down of the guard, a kind of letting, oh, well, do we even really need to teach those kinds of things? I mean, and so you get into all those kind of arguments as to why would you even need a defense against the dark arts thing because Voldemort is gone, right? Or so you think, right? And so that much of the drama of the series is sort of focused on this course that they offer, and not only are all the professors, they're one and dones, right? But there seems to be a sort of a real question as to why would you even have such a thing in the first place? And the way that the stories unfold is that Dumbledore insists that this remain part of the curriculum. And so when he's kind of forced out in the middle of the series, the people who come in and take over Hogwarts, who are training the next generation of wizards and witches, right? The question is always, how do you teach this thing? And so there's this desire to suppress it because it's something seen as either retrograde, or even kind of almost a kind of you're fixating on the wrong negative thing, right? And so maybe for me, as a school teacher, I think a lot about these issues anyway. And I have been teaching for the better part of 3 decades now. And I see what you can do with a student in high school, but I know that they're being kind of frog marched into a kind of world that in certain respects, I feel that I have ill prepared them for because they're going to go to college. And at least the way that I see things, they go to college and either they sort of do one of two things, Paul. They either become pragmatist nihilists or they become true believers in the new gospel. You
And
know,
the new gospel is,
well, yeah, so the new gospel can either be a kind of sort of very sort of politically tinged, a gospel of liberation, we might call it,
yeah,
or a sort of a kind of a nihilism. It's difficult. I mean, we can sort of play with all those various strains, right? But what they all seem to rest upon, right, is what Taylor talks about as the immanent frame, right? That it presupposes that metaphysics are a waste of time, at the very least, probably a psyop against you, by the powers that be. And so it all kind of exists in this world. Whereas, the stuff, where we come from, you and I, in our various ways, this little corner business, right? It's sort of a reopening up of that frame, or a reconnecting, maybe, that frame to that which has been forsaken.
Now when Grimgriz, of course, when Grimgriz, here we're doing a commentary on Grimgriz's
Yeah,
video.
here we are. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. It's a channel of a little over 1,000 subs. And here we're commenting on it like, like we're having a conversation about Jordan Peterson or
the
something.
latest Jordan Peterson drop.
That's right.
It's
This is the latest Grimgriz drop that we're having a conversation on. If people don't understand just how central Grimgriz is to this entire effort, he's colonized well in a very interesting way. But we started, I think, okay, let me back up a little bit.
Yeah.
Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, and I grew up among a fair amount of Italian Catholics in northern New Jersey. They were a significant population. And as a young man, the Italian girls were pretty good looking. So
there it is. Yeah.
He had attention. But the Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics, Dutch Calvinists, probably Norwegian Lutherans, all of these groups came into the United States, late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, the two world wars, and between the wars disrupted some of that impacted the African American population, which of course is a big part of my story, the Great Migration up to the north. And then after the Second World War, you have the Second World War is this interesting moment in the world where the United States is sort of galvanized for war. And it certainly plays a significant part in the European theater. But in many ways, the Pacific theater is really where the United States becomes the great hegemonic superpower, the great empire of the 20th century.
That's right.
And it does so basically by mass production. I mean, the U.S. begins the war, and the Japanese are just kicking America's butt. But of course, the great Japanese admiral knows when they bring the United States into the war the way that they did was sort of a gamble that hopefully, the shock of Pearl. The idea was that Americans are weak, they're soft, they're comfortable. The shock of Pearl Harbor will make America sort of flinch back and say no, and they don't understand this deep pride. And so America basically says, we're going to destroy the Japanese by just burying them industrially. And of course, that's exactly what happens in the war in the Pacific. In Europe, of course, the Russians bury Germany, that not industrially, but by birth rate. We're just going to send waves of soldiers, human fodder, and they might kill all these poor Russian soldiers, but Stalin doesn't care. One way or another, we're going to grind them down, and then the pressures of both sides, Germany collapses, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all of these religious groups in America that came into the middle of the 20th century with all of this spiritual formation, but many of these groups were set against each other. So a denomination like the Christian Reformed Church is, deeply, all of that anti-Catholicism is very much in there. And I would imagine from the other side, all of the Protestants and Catholics, after a number of centuries, are sort of still pitted against each other. What happens in this great movement in the United States is that they all become, brothers and sisters in arms to fight the Japanese and the Germans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the formation And I think when we're talking, I mean, because what we're really talking about here is formation. Yesterday on the Freddie and Paul show, so I used the first question and answer of the Heidelberg Catechism as my conclusion to the sermon this week. And of course, Nancy watches my videos. Nancy riffs on that, and her little tell comments are really important if you understand her story, because she says, and she's right, when she was a little girl, she's basically a boomer.
Yeah.
When she was a little girl, every week, in addition to the Christian school that you also had catechism class taught by the minister or an elder, and grades were assigned
Oh.
for catechism class. I mean, and so this process of formation was deep within the Christian Reformed Church, and all sorts of things followed from that. Denominational identity, denominational confidence, sacrificial giving on the part of people for the denomination, devotional practices at the home. Now, again, this was fairly sectarian. I mean, people would comment in Western Michigan, evangelicals, that, oh, the Christian Reformed Church, they think they're the only ones that are, if you're Christian Reformed and you get, Jesus welcomes you in. If you're Reformed Church of America, might have to do some proving. But of course, all bets are off on everyone else.
Now,
And
Paul,
so we have these themes of confidence and formation.
right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So this is great, right? So when in the Christian Reform communities, when did let's say when was it not the case that a kid went to catechism class with a pastor or an elder and received grades? So sort of using that as the kind of the funny model. When did that stop,
It
or
all
did it?
depended on where those churches were within the urban monoculture.
Ah, okay, good. Okay, keep going.
So when I was a seminarian in the 1980s, as part of my seminary field education, I had a job driving to Hudsonville, which is now a bedroom community, was an agricultural community outside of Grand Rapids. I drove to Hudsonville and I taught on Sunday morning. See, it was sort of a tradition. First, you had it midweek,
Right.
and then it went to Sunday morning instead of Sunday school.
Ah, okay.
And
Okay.
in fact, just recently, CW has been pestering me to do more dog fooding. And so
Love it.
this was a book. It was basically a commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. So the Christian Reformed Church used to just teach the catechism as such.
Yep.
And then it started creating materials to sort of help, because they thought the catechism was just going to be, in the culture of the 60s and 70s, the catechism was thought to be, first of all, pedagogically, it was archaic because it was rote memorization. Teacher asks the questions, students memorize and gives the answer, and you're graded on how you can memorize the answer. My bet is, what I'm saying now, there are perfect analogs in Catholicism.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm looking for my copy of the Baltimore Catechism, which is, in many respects, the fellow traveler here. You and I like to talk about this notion of opponent processing, and just the idea of a catechism itself. It to me is fascinating, and I'm kicking myself not doing a quick Google search before we jumped on here. But my guess is that there was a rush somewhere around 1520s or so to push out a lot of catechisms, right? Because all of a sudden propositional concerns took the forefront in the wake of Luther is sort of sparking it. I mean, you and I could go for days and days and days on all this in a different time, but my guess is that catechisms proliferated and have continued to proliferate. Now, do you have a rough date on the Heidelberg Catechism?
Yeah,
The
1560s.
1560s. Okay, right. So, which would then, the corollary in the Catholic world would be the Tridentine Catechism. And I don't know though. I don't know all the permutations of it, but the one that would have been preeminent here in the United States of America, which is based upon Trent, is the Baltimore Catechism. Baltimore, because Baltimore is the oldest diocese in America and still has a sort of a position of prominence in that regard, even though it's not as big as some of the other ones now, of course.
Because
But
Baltimore was, I mean,
the
Catholics
first,
didn't really come to America very early. And so
yeah,
Baltimore was sort of this strange.
yeah, Maryland. I mean,
Yes.
Maryland. So like for instance, so my mother was born in 1944. And so she would have been steeped in the Baltimore Catechism. And it's a series of questions and answers, very similar to what you're saying here about the Heidelberg Catechism. And it was rote, right? You memorized it. And so like to this day, I can probably poke an 80-year-old Catholic and I could probably get those verbatim answers from them,
Yep.
even though it is essentially abandoned wholesale, essentially overnight, 65, 66-ish,
Yep.
right, in the wake of the council,
Yep.
right? And so, but it's the same kind of thing. And that's why, again, I don't want to sidetrack us here with discussions about the council. We've done that before, but that's not the point of this conversation. But it sounds to me like in our various traditions, right? There was something that occurred sometime in the 60s, right? 60s, 70s, let's call it, in which this kind of uh, focus on a catechism, a kind of axiomatic, starting from, arguing from axioms, like a catechism or like Euclid or, any of those kinds of things, that got abandoned. And so then what are you then? Like, what do you do? So I can sort of get, what in the CRC tradition, as far as formation is concerned, once it moved away from the explicit instruction in the Heidelberg Catechism, what took its place?
I think we have to talk about pedagogy, which is interesting, of course, because you are a teacher. And of
Yeah,
course, pastors, it's one of
yeah,
the things pastors
yeah,
do. I think a big part of, you're exactly right. Last time I taught the Heidelberg Catechism to my Sunday school class, that was pre-YouTube days.
yeah,
I was always, before my father died too. I wondered how this was going to go in my Bible, in my Sunday school class, because I had a lot of people with no CRC backgrounds and they
right.
loved the Heidelberg Catechism.
Yeah,
I was really
yeah,
shocked. I talked to my
yeah,
father, who was still alive then. He said every time I taught the Heidelberg Catechism at Northside, people loved it. I thought
yeah,
that's interesting. But now when the whole reason for the emergence of these kinds of books. Now it was so funny because I remember seeing this book around when I was a little kid. It was a
yeah,
little ahead of me, but
yeah,
reading it now, it just drips of, you have kind of
yeah.
60s,
Oh
70s
yeah, yeah.
art.
Oh yeah, I could give you. I mean, again, I could give you, multiple iterations of this in the Catholic Register as well, right? And
Yeah.
and it's graduated. So there's like the Baltimore Catechism 1, which sort of upgrades to 2 to 3 to 4, and 4 was, I believe, if memory serves, 4 was like the adult one, like so you kind of work your way up to it, and like there's the sort of the funny art from the 60s, and then the funny art from the 70s, and then the sort of then the iterations in the 80s. It's just cringe,
Yeah.
and all of that. But it was essentially, it sounds to me, it was a sales document. Sorry, it was a sales document. Wait, maybe it's a catechism masquerading as a sales document, or maybe it's a sales document masquerading as a catechism. I'm not sure which one, but it's a sales document.
Well, pedagogy was critical in
Yeah,
this
yeah, okay, okay,
because one of the things, of course, that had happened was a big critique of, what one of my favorite professors in seminary was actually he had been a school teacher, and then he had gotten a doctorate in something in religious education. He'd been
yeah,
a school teacher in Christian school, and he talked about mug to jug education, which was from my mug to your jug. And
yeah,
so the point
yeah.
of education was for the student to regurgitate, in this case with a catechism.
But you use the word. I just want to note that it's so hard to even talk about this without adopting the language of the people who employed it to attack it.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Because this was now the irony of that is, of course, the fact that in critiquing this form of education, They actually used it because I just used the word of that catechism in the supposed dismemberment of that particular form of pedagogy. And in that particular form of pedagogy, because that particular form of pedagogy was dismissed as not being sufficient for Christian formation, because of course what we wanted from the students is to engage critically with the material, and in that day rephrase the material in your own words.
Okay, why was that? Because again, I heard it too,
Yeah,
believe me,
yeah, yeah.
in my own way. Why? What's the boogeyman there? You know what I mean by that?
I know exactly what the boogeyman was there because of everything that was. So these silos of religious formation and inter-Christian religious warfare that had been that basically for hundreds of years had been maintained
Yes.
was, well, I mean, one of the things that we had in our documents was all about the detestable, the Roman Mass was idolatrous.
Sure.
Because of course you add images and you add,
Right.
and so all of this stuff was maintained, and you formed children with this language so that they would get the heebie-jeebies when they went by a Roman Catholic church. I still have that built into me today. That kind of formation works well. But I think part of what happens in the Second World War is where you have Christian Reformed youth, Irish Catholic youth,
Jews.
Italian Catholic, you begin to have intermarriage. You're looking across the bunk in your transport across the Pacific, and he's got his rosary, and you're looking at him saying, well, that's idolatrous, that rosary. You're looking at all of this stuff, but in the end, you're in the foxhole with this guy, and you eventually say, I'm not so sure he's not going to heaven with me.
Yeah, that's right.
And so we do, and again, this is behind the council, of course, too. You have these experiences that begin to say, maybe we need to look at the old ways and reconsider them. And I think you and I, by virtue of the fact that we have a friendship and we're talking about this video, and we're making it together, we're comparing notes, we would say, yes, that's true. But we're doing a reassessment of all of this and saying, okay, in the process, what it appears, first of all, we had a confidence in our churches that we no longer have. And part of what was lost in the transport ships going across the Pacific was that confidence, because a lot of that confidence was built on, I'm right and you Catholics are wrong.
Yeah.
And that sort of psychologically is a very strong thing for us.
Yeah.
And so we did lose confidence, but along the way, and I think again, then with the counterculture, there was in America, and I think the civil rights movement had a big piece of this, because the civil rights movement pointed out it was impossible for mainliners, eventually evangelicals, Roman Catholics, to not look at the systemic, multi-generational treatment of African Americans and say, wow, did we ever miss that? And if we missed that, what else did we miss? And I think there's a big part of the rise of the urban monoculture, where we now have a catechism involving racism, quite rightly. This was what I was raised in. But at the same time, all of these other questions. So then suddenly, when the civil rights movement sort of becomes the point of the spear for a whole bunch of other liberation movements. Well, you've treated African Americans poorly. What about women? What about gays?
Right.
What about, and then everything comes in, and at some point you begin to say, well, where really is the center of this gospel? And, along the way, for the last number of decades, the Christian Reformed Church has been looking at the Roman Catholic Church and thought, well, have we sort of, have we sort of misrepresented the Roman Catholics? And I would say, yes, we did. But what then does that mean? Where then is the gospel, and how do we form children in it? And I think whereas sort of the confidence built in generations before has been lost, and we're at a place where now suddenly we're looking around for confidence and identity and new centers, and then even pedagogically to say, well, you know what, memorization, it's a pretty profound pedagogical tool for children, because guess what, I can recite how many ditties from television. Now we're back to Grim Grisland, from the world of Set, Cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, Frosted Flakes, they're great.
Mikey, he likes it.
Exactly. So we threw out kind of the programmatic repetition and formation by memorization of our youth and gave it all to Set.
Yeah, that's right. So the liturgies, yeah, right. And so there became all of these sort of subtle and crypto liturgies and dramas that we oriented our lives around. So even something as silly as Saturday morning cartoons, right? And whatever, fill in the blank. But no, I think that's exactly right. So for me, it was Dukes of Hazzard on Friday evenings. We would rush home from the pizza place so that we could, get up in front of the TV to watch Bo and Luke Duke, right? Or what have you. So, right. So there was an abandonment of the notion of repetitions as a formative reality. And therefore there was this sort of opening up to the extempore or the spontaneous or what have you. It's almost like we wanted to have the feeling without the content. We wanted to, there's this in a rush toward and I'm sure you heard this buzzword as magic word all the time, which was relevance, right? The church needs to be relevant. So I've always been struck, right? I mean, look, exactly, right. And again, I'm sorry I don't have my Catholic versions of these things, but they're exactly the same. It's exactly the same thing. So now, Paul, I'm interested that we heard this word relevant growing up all the time as a fear word, right? That we're not relevant, and yet here in this corner we talk about relevance realization all the time.
Yeah.
So I wonder what kind of connections you make between that and what has Vervaeke been able to get us to re-see about the word relevant?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's sort of it's relocated into a different area.
Okay.
But I wanna before we go too far into
that,
I want to get into there was a reason behind the dismissal of rote memorization as a formative tool. And there was a hermeneutic of suspicion operating there, in that basically the argument was these prior generations have been, and another word, relevance, of course, was the word you wanted, indoctrination.
Yeah. Indoctrination. Yeah, that's right.
These people were indoctrinated into the Heidelberg Catechism.
That's right.
And now what they are resistant to, and in some cases they are resistant to critiques about racism. And again, in the Christian Reformed Church, there was a battle that was fought over Timothy Christian schools. And the way it's sort of, but just in terms of temperamentally, conservatives, of course, would say, no, we're going to keep using rote memorization. And it was the progressives, who tended to be urban, who would say, oh,
who else likes rote memorization? The racists like rote memorization.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. So it's a suite, right? So we think of these things as sort of a lot of these things are sort of put together like a combo package, right? And
That's
so
right.
you're going to take all of these things. Sorry, not sorry, right? And so, oh well, if you don't like this thing, then you need to take everything else away too.
Yeah.
This sort of this collection. It needs
And
to
then
be
you had
disambiguated, right?
the urban rural divide continues to sort of this continues to sort of happen as the urban churches. We're the churches that we are anti-racist. We're the
Right.
churches that we are not legalistic, because again, part of that package, part of that suite was Sabbatarianism. So we're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
bound by
Yeah.
those. And so you could easily sort of poke the Sabbatarians and say, well, they're legalists. You had Pharisees.
Yeah.
And then, then in terms of the biblical narrative, you can play off those
Totally.
Heidelberg Catechism memorizing, Sabbath eating at home people as Pharisees. And we are the new liberated Jesus followers who, are not living under the law. And we're the ones, of course, who are loving the we're loving the racial minorities, and we're loving the sexual minorities, and you just set up this whole system of assimilations and groupings, whereby the urban monoculture is clearly the coming of the age to come.
Yeah. Right. So
And
that,
all
that
these
yeah.
recalcitrant conservatives back there still doing Heidelberg Catechism on Wednesday after school.
Right. Holding on to their wooden clogs, right?
Yeah,
Right. I
holding
mean,
on to that's exactly right.
right.
And
And so,
I could just imagine exactly the same thing happening in Roman Catholic
oh
spaces.
yeah, no, it's nuns and their habits. It's the rosary. It's all of those distinctives. It's the meat on Fridays. The no meat on Fridays. I mean, it's all of those distinctives. Get just decluttered, just whoosh. Just taken away, because we're not going to do that stuff anymore.
Right.
That's old stuff, right? But again, like in my world, the world, or rather the world that I showed up in, which had just recently been decluttered, that was done from the top.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Again,
Yes.
we can get into all the nitty gritty, but essentially the way that a rank and file parishioner at St. Joe's down the street experienced it was, this came from on high and it was all whooshed away. And now we're going to start fresh, and we have guitars at mass now.
Yep. And what happens then? And so this is being played out. Of course, the Christian World Church is a far tinier scale than the Roman Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm.
And so now suddenly, of course, the women in church office fight in the Christian Reformed Church was sort of peak baby boomer urban monoculture hegemony in terms of the wave that goes through the Christian Reformed Church.
Right.
And so then, women in church, women in ministry then becomes just the next thing on that list. And then, of course, this 25-year fight in the Christian Reformed Church over this finally gets settled, because the Christian Reformed Church, just out of exhaustion, is tired of this fight. We have to get it off of our synodical dockets, because it's the only thing that's occupying the attention, the relevance realization of the Christian Reformed Church. So then we have this pragmatic compromise, basically the local option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And about 30 to 50,000 members of the Christian Reformed Church leave from the most conservative area.
Got it.
But then we also begin to see conservatism starting to come up, and this is what really surprises.
Yeah.
That started coming up in urban areas.
Yeah.
We're like, conservatism isn't supposed to be in urban areas. So then, of course, you get all the way to now in the Christian Reformed Church and the fight over same-sex marriage, and all of the leadership had been formed by this wave, and now suddenly they're just in shock, because and they don't realize that, number one, many in the urban monoculture just kept moving. Yeah. They just kept moving into assimilation in the urban monoculture.
Right,
And
because you can really, not to be too cute about it, but you really can only serve one master, right? And again, I'm not trying to score cheap points here, but I just being very clear about it, right? What spirit are you following? And it would appear that the spirit of, if the summum bonum is liberation, then the summum bonum doesn't, in that iteration, does not seem to have carved out a place for it piety.
right. And
And
piety is met with suspicion.
right, of course, yeah,
I
right.
mean, that's
It's
just it.
old-fashioned. Mhm,
And
mhm.
so even though there's all of these, and this, of course, James K. Smith writes about this a decade ago in the Christian Reformed Church, there's all of these implicit liturgies
Yes, love
that
it.
have in fact been forming the urban monoculture. And so now suddenly, because of the way the Christian Reformed Church works in terms of synods and classes and delegates and all of that, suddenly you get to Synod 2022 and 2023, and the progressives who have, just by virtue of their filters, imagine they are the vanguard of history and everyone will sweep along and it's only a matter of time. Just go back and listen to those synods. They're all on YouTube. Speech after speech after speech of the progressives are basically reciting their liturgies, and then the votes are taken, and it's like, we're 30% of the church. We're
Yeah, right,
30% of the votes. I
right.
mean,
It's like
someone could say, we want a 2/3 majority. Yeah, you're past that, buddy.
yeah,
And
right,
and I'd look around and say, your votes are no longer there because your churches are no longer
right.
there.
You have no fruit, right?
Yeah.
This is my constant refrain, with those would-be liberationists in my own church, they don't have children, and I mean that literally, sorry, physically. I mean that physically they don't have children. But I also mean it metaphorically, right? That they do not bear, they don't have a legacy in the various ways in which we understand that word. And of course, similarly interesting because my church has a celibate clergy. So the only way that the church recreates itself is to have, a particularly fecund laity. But what they have found out that even if the primary preachers of the gospel are celibate men, in theory, um, what the gospel is still matters, right? And I remember this distinctly, right? That, when I was 17 years old, I made the very quick deduction. Sorry, I'm just going to shut this off. I made the very quick deduction. Sorry. Um, no, no, you're good. You're good. You're good. I made a very quick deduction that if this is the gospel, that you're telling me, um, I don't need the church. I don't need you. I can march when I need to march. I can go to a soup kitchen if I need to go to a soup kitchen, but I'm just going to skip all the other bits. Like, why do I care about confession? Why do I care about the Eucharist? Why
I can
do I
go to
care
a
about
therapist if I
right?
think that there are things that need to be worked through.
Amen. Amen. Right. And so that the gospel that they taught was, and again, I know I'm being somewhat me about this. It's a dead letter. It's a dead gospel. And so when I hear when I was listening to you talk about when the progressives woke up after one of the synods and were like, oh my gosh, we don't have the votes, it's because you forgot the most basic fundamental reality, which is the next generation.
Yeah.
You're so busy trying to be ahead of the curve of, history, as if history has a shape. I mean, right? I mean, that's the implicit things that you buy in with the progressivist myth or mythos. You were all worried about being in front of the arc of history, but you forgot the future.
The future of
Yeah, thank you.
your institution, that in fact the church mattered. Now, there are deep conversations to be had here with respect to church and culture. And a lot of the other conversations that we're having now, like dread Christian nationalism and Christian imperialism, and
Yes.
what happens in terms of, one speed versus two speed, with John Calvin looking to make all of Geneva a Christian city, and the
Yeah.
Puritans, when they come to New Haven, Connecticut, and they set it out, and these Puritans are coming into the New World, and they're establishing the New Jerusalem. That's
Yeah.
what they're doing,
Yeah.
which is interesting, of course, because Constantinople, you're establishing the New Jerusalem, which is
That's right.
Constantinople, and so all of these themes just running through history. But and so then you set up the battle, and of course the mainline Protestants, this. So I think when we get all the way down to it, I mean, because of course the Protestant in the Protestant Reformation and Luther and Calvin and England and all of this stuff, they're trying to rescue the gospel from something. And now here we are today, Protestant and Catholic, looking at what has happened. And so we want to rescue the gospel from something because it seems to have gone astray. And I think part of, we're talking about the fact that in a catechism like the Heidelberg, that we're attempting to fix the gospel. I don't mean fix in terms of repair. I mean fix in terms of concretize, set. We're attempting to set the gospel into this document. And therefore, if we can reliably transpose this document from this page into the memory of people, we can deliver something into this world in all of its four Vervaekian 4 P's of knowing sort of way. And part of what we look back now on and say, wow, there was some success in that. And yet we also look back on it and say, and there were some other things in there too that we're thinking about. And I think part of what we get to is the fact that the gospel is a kind of thing. And of course, the Apostle Paul says that the angels epithumia looking into this thing, because they're always, even the angels are always trying to get their minds around this thing, that the only and of course this is deeply Christian, the gospel is best instantiated in a human being. Now, of course, as Christians, we say the archetypal gospel instantiation is, of course, Christ, but then into human beings and then into communities. I think that was part of what's going on in terms of the Protestant, the Calvin. We want to instantiate this into a city, but okay, we're going to try and instantiate it into text on a page in a particular form, and to not speak ill of, let's say. So this was a product of Gord Spikeman, who was I didn't have met Calvin, but he taught at Calvin, and he wrote this, and he wrote a systematic theology that I picked up. Not saying it again, but they felt something. They felt something in the counterculture movement where they said there needs to be a further transposition. We no longer have confidence in the catechism. And so we're going to try to transpose the catechism into something like this. But of course, the gospel needs to be transposed into our culture in a way so that we no longer abuse African Americans or Jews or Catholics. People seldom remember that the Klan was not just, maybe their fiercest hatred was against African Americans, but they really hated the Catholics and the Jews too.
Like right next to it is the Catholic and the Jews. Yeah, I know that's true. How are you using this word transpose? Help me out just a little bit.
Well, I am thinking about Lewis's did a really good essay on transpositions.
Okay.
That it's again one of his essays. It's a short work. It's easily found.
Yep.
But when we think about, so there's the gospel, and let's assume that in many ways the gospel, what's the relationship between the gospel and the Holy Spirit? Boy, pretty close.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between gospel and Jesus? What's between gospel and the Father? Okay, so but how does the gospel become flesh? And how does the gospel take on instantiation? And so we have these gospels in a book. And so we already have this relationship between logos and gospel.
So
I
want to jump in here real quick though, because this is one of those weird things where, if you scratch like a hardcore Catholic guy, right, who's like loves apologetics and does all this kind of stuff, and might have a particular, love of going after Protestants, a classic sort of Catholic talking point is, well, how did all those people get saved before the books.
Yeah.
And again, I just for the record, if there are any Catholics watching here, like I basically agree with that. I'm not arguing with the Catholic talking point here. I'm just putting it out there because that to me was a real watershed moment in my own figuring out where I fit in with my own denomination, and should I be a Protestant, and all those kinds of things. And I'm talking early on, and I remember coming across, well, that's weird to me, right? That there was a time, a pretty big chunk of time in which there was nothing written down, not certainly nothing collected. So, well, that's interesting. So then, well, how did it happen? And I remember much later on reading a novel called Quo Vadis, and as you know, I'm a story guy, I'm a lit guy, and it was the first time that I encountered the character, the character of Saint Peter. And there's a great scene in the novel in which
Hmm.
the protagonist and
What's the name of the novel?
it's called Quo Vadis. It's written by Sienkiewicz. He's a Polish
Is it in
novelist.
English? I don't read Latin.
Oh, it's in English. Oh, yeah, it's all translated. Yeah, no,
Okay.
this is like one of the most famous novels of all time. Like it's like one of the most widely published novels of all time. It's really quite good.
When was
And
it
it's
written?
oh gosh, I've been meaning to talk to you about this forever. I don't know. Look it up. Do a Google search. Google me while I talk about it. So, Jamie, you're my Jamie today. Oh, I would really like to be Jamie. I think it'd be a fun job. Anyway,
1951 film.
okay, so
Interesting.
it's a film. So
Oh, that'd be
my guess is
interesting.
it's the 30s. Sienkiewicz is the last name, Sienk. Sienkiewicz, maybe.
Yeah. In Poland. It's
Yeah.
set in ancient Rome during the rule of Emperor Nero in 64. The novel tells the story of the romance between Marcus Vinicius, a young pagan Roman officer, and Lygia, a Christian barbarian princess raised in a Roman household. Oh, sounds
So okay.
interesting.
So no, it's a great novel. Okay, number one, it's a great novel. If you're into novels, read it. Trust me. So, so this is okay. I've been meaning to talk to you about this forever. So when I read Holland's Dominion, okay, I'm reading this thing and I'm thinking like, yeah, yeah, of course, of course, of course, of course. And I realized that this novel tells the story that Holland captures in Dominion. And I mean it this way. The Roman officer falls in love with Lygia, and he doesn't understand why she won't sleep with him. So you have this encounter of the pagan sexual ethic and this Christian sexual ethic. And you really see, that was my first sort of incarnate encounter with a Roman who was being Roman, right? The way that Holland talks about, the this in his dominion. So at any rate, so you see it all unfold, and as he falls in love with her, and he's sort of being catechized in a way by her example, she takes him to the catacombs, and he meets Peter.
Oh,
Yeah, like Peter, like he's
cool.
there, like doing his thing, right? And
Yeah.
so so then of course my mind is popping at this point, being like, oh my gosh, that's right. Like on some radically one-to-one level, everybody who now calls themselves Christian owes that gift, that fact, to somebody somewhere 2,000 years ago shook hands with Peter,
Yeah.
with Paul, like the person,
Yep.
and then your mind just explodes. Like, well, what did he do? Did he like give him a website? Did he give him a catechism? No, of course not. The whole point was that we gather together, right? And then you start to make sense out of all those hymns you sang in vacation Bible school, and they'll know we're Christians by our love, and then you're like, oh, but like actually, like it's no abstraction. It's a real incarnate thing, So the formation then is transjective, I think, is what Vervaeke would say
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Like it's formed person to person, or
Yeah.
sorry, person to person, right? There's no pamphlet, there's no bullet points. Now that comes in much later, and that's a real thing, and I don't mean to elide over that, but at its core, it was, I mean, can you imagine that, Paul? I mean, can you imagine just like being a guy like living in Ephesus, let's say, right? And you're going about your business selling fruit or whatever it is you're selling in the market, and you meet this guy. And your first inclination, of course, is like, this is a crazy Jew. Like, what does he have to do with me? And then all you listen. I mean, what must that have been like? I mean, talk about charismatic. I mean, that must have been, well, miraculous, right? Miraculous.
Well, I think your initial question, I think, is exactly right. And in terms of how I understand my tradition, is Christians are made by the Holy Spirit. Now, that's punting in a way.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm
But
with you. I get
you know, but at the same time, when I think about, of course, the Protestants had this critique of apostolic succession, I can understand if all you've seen are a bunch of fairly corrupt,
fat, corrupt. Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally.
you'd have a
Totally.
little skepticism of an apostolic succession. But that's very much what we're talking about. It's something that's transmitted,
Yeah.
person to person, and but sometimes it's transmitted by a book. You know, you have these. So Dante
Well,
Venegas.
the books are clearly a technology to aid and assist and to flatten the curve, maybe.
That's right.
All right. So that I don't. Look, I'm a book guy. I mean, I love books. I see in them great value, but it's still like there's a kind of a witness that the book kind of almost represents,
Right,
a one-to-oneness,
right, and I've always had this. Again, when I talk about the end of the protest, now again, when I say end, I don't mean like, oh, it ends tomorrow. No, it's the Protestant protest.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, the Protestant protest, and it's not like the Protestant protest is going to end tomorrow, and it's the end of the Protestant protest will probably be in some ways like the end of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I love the rest is history. Had a couple of episodes on when I never thought when did the Roman Empire end? It's actually an extremely difficult question to answer because in some ways the Roman Empire is still with us.
Still with us, right?
I mean, when I go down to the Capitol here in Sacramento and I look at that building, it's like, why does that building look like it does?
Yeah. That's right.
The Roman Empire is still with us right here in the middle of Sacramento. So no, I think that's a great question, and I think it's a timely question, and it's important. When I was thinking about this conversation this morning before I got on, I was thinking, what are we going to talk about? Because in many ways,
but by the way, it's hilarious that both of us have that thought. And like, honestly, if we had world and time enough, we probably just wouldn't stop talking for like 19 hours. But anyway, go ahead.
That's when we've been there 10,000 years. That's what we'll wind up doing, among other things. So, when I was thinking about, defense against the dark arts, and I was thinking about, all of these, so often the defense against the dark arts professor at Hogwarts is right there in the middle of this embroilment. But the way you set it up initially is important, because a lot of what happened in the counterculture and the assimilation of our churches in that culture was exactly what you just said, where we no longer need to worry about talking about Protestant Catholic differences anymore. And again, part of what's key in this little corner is we like talking about differences between denominations, but we like talking about it in a different way.
Yeah.
And I loved visiting you. First of all, this is another one of the little videos that I thought of making this morning. I'm doing these on my membership channel now, just these little cell phone videos, because, visiting, we're doing it through a personal network now. I haven't gotten a book to read all about Catholicism. If I go and visit Kale on this campus, which is monastic in origin, and I walk with you into the chapel, which is a beautiful building, and I noticed that, and of course this is new for me, I noticed that when we walk into the chapel, you have your rituals and your movements that, and I watch that, it's like, that's
right.
That's interesting.
You genuflect to the tabernacle and you bow to the altar. Right. And so the altar is the place where the sacrifice occurs. Think Aslan, right? So that's the altar of sacrifice. And then the tabernacle is the holding of the Eucharist, of the consecrated
Right.
host, right? So that's the sort of the two movements you make when you walk in.
So now I am a child of generations of the protest, whereas of course I'm also reading. I'm also always reading too many books at once. I'm also reading Bruce Gordon's biography of John Calvin, which is
Okay.
almost everyone would agree it's the best biography out there of Calvin.
Okay.
And you have to understand that these Luther, another interesting thing about the reformers that Erie nails right at the beginning of his book, they're all people of a selective generation.
It's amazing, right? It's like
Yes.
in the corollary for us, right, is that if we're thinking about it in boomer, Gen X, Gen Z, millennial terms, they're millennials, right? Or maybe they're Gen Zs, right?
Okay,
So
keep going. Yeah, keep going.
if I'm remembering my Erie correctly, this is his book Reformations, by the way,
Yes.
folks. They are all born after the printing press has been. They've never known a world in which the printing press hasn't been a reality,
Right.
right? And so,
And the new world is discovered.
right, exactly, and that the new world has been. But actually, I believe the new world. No, you're exactly right. Wait,
It's
no,
right on the cusp there.
Right. Well, so New World's 1492. So, and then the Gutenberg is 1537. No, it can't be.
No, but
It's
printing.
14. Sorry, printing press is 1450s, I believe.
Yes.
And then
yes.
and then Columbus is 1402. Okay. So
and it's going to take a little time for that printing press to really
right,
get going too.
right. But it's part of their social imaginary.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's where Taylor is so important for me here, right? So that this is a very specific generation in which they know about the new world, and the Gutenberg press has always been a reality. So books, and of course, books were very quickly, they proliferated very quickly, because when people realized, oh my gosh, I can get a book, it became like a thing. And we can see this exact same thing happen with our own technologies here,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
It's like high-speed internet. It's like once it was a thing, everybody got it, like within 5 years.
Yep.
Right.
So this age of breakthroughs.
Good. Yeah.
Luther born 1482 or 1483.
Yeah.
And then you look at 1480, 1482, 1483, 1484, 1485.
So Luther was 11 when Columbus, 10 or 11 when Columbus discovered the New World.
Yeah.
And that's just crazy.
Yes. And it was, what was amazing when I read Erie's book was I read that chapter. It's like,
yeah.
All of these years of education.
Yeah.
No one ever pointed that out.
Yeah.
As if it was incidental.
Like, by the way, Columbus, Gutenberg, whatever. Let's get back to Luther. Like, no, like they are formed by their social imaginary, just like we are. Like, and that's why it's exactly how my mind was popping when I was looking at that. Right? It's like, oh, of course, because so if you had been 20 years older than Luther, let's say, you would have had a memory of a world without books and without Columbus. So therefore, without, doubling the size of what you thought the world was, let's just say. What you think of as possible and real is radically different.
Yes.
Pivotal. I called it on Twitter the other day. I sort of called it, it's akin to it's an axial revolution.
Yes. And I think, so even just looking at this little corner, Peterson, he's a year older. He was born in 62.
Yeah.
I was born in 63. Vervaeke, very much the same age. I think John's maybe 2 years older than I am.
Yeah.
Peugeot's on the young end.
Yeah.
You look at the Weinsteins. You look at Sam Harris. You look
Barron,
at all. Yeah.
Barron.
Yes.
Bishop Barron.
Barron, he's a little old. When was Barron born?
I'm pretty sure he was born maybe late 50s. He's not an old guy.
No, but he's more boomer than I am.
That's true.
59.
Yeah. Okay. So you cheat toward the Gen X range of the boom. Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yep.
All right, go ahead.
He's more boomer than I am. When he taught, because Dylan was already passé
When you came around. Yeah, yeah,
when
no,
I come
exactly.
around.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, culture is
I know
moving
what you
that
mean.
fast.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
But okay, think about the moon landings. Imagine
Right.
if we went to the moon and there was a world of people on the moon
That's right. That's right. That's
that
right.
could be enslaved, and they had minerals that we wanted, and they
Mhm.
had crops that we wanted,
And they
and
have
getting
souls that need to be saved, right? I mean, it's
yes,
like it's that's I know people don't cynical people don't like to see that as a salient part of their imaginary, but it absolutely was. In fact, that's the miracle of colonialization, oddly enough, is that the Pope said, sorry, they're people. Deal with it.
yeah, and it was, but that was a raging, and then you look at all of the racism, and especially once evolution comes on, it's so amazing how people forget
Yeah.
what all the debates were at the end of the 19th century with respect to race and evolution.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't until the Second World War that that sort of gets wrung out of the culture, because after seeing what Hitler did and what the Japanese were thinking, it's like, we don't really want to do this.
Well, remember, the book to read here is The War Against the Weak. It was not the fact that Hitler's racism, the fact that eugenics and racism get hung on Hitler's neck is pretty historically convenient because it was a much bigger deal in America than it was in Germany. It has to be pointed out.
Yep, yep, yep. But okay, so back to the Reformation period,
Yeah.
you have this massive transformation in the imaginary of Europe. And of course, you have Spain, which had just recently sort of been wrested. I mean, before then, everybody's thinking Catholic, Islam. And of course, the Jews are, sprinkled in this mix. But that's the big enemy is Islam.
Right.
That's who they're perpetually at war with for centuries. And now suddenly Spain gets de-Islamified.
Right.
And of course the Jews have to leave. And those are probably my ancestors.
Yeah.
And then suddenly Spain, which is sort of this new country.
It's a new thing, right? It's Isabel and Ferdinand, right?
Right.
They join forces in their marriage to create Spain as we know it.
Right. And Portugal, when Columbus, of course, an Italian, goes to Portugal and wants money to go that way, the Portuguese are like, you're out of your mind. Everybody knows there's something over there.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody also knows it's too far.
Yeah.
We're not going to do this. And the Spanish are like, what do we got?
They took a flyer. They took a flyer, like, whatever. Here, take 3 boats.
Yeah. And then suddenly it catapults Spain into this Catholic superpower.
Yeah.
Which then, of course, is going to set the Protestants as tremendously terrified of Roman Catholics for now generations to come into the Americas. And people wonder, why so much anti-Catholicism in America? They're scared to death of the French and the Spanish.
Right. And especially, again, people forget this because we're used to looking at the current maps, but your folk up in the Netherlands, they were run by the Spaniards.
Yeah, they
right?
revolted.
Right. So it's like these weird empires were strange and morphed, and very strange.
And even back to the Heidelberg Catechism,
yeah,
if you're in northern Germany, if you're in Germany and you want to resist on the economics, the politics, all of these things, you of course adopt a different religion.
Yeah.
So we need to write this catechism so our children grow up. Right. Just like in what's happening in schools right now is that they are writing catechisms so that their children grow up and, a boy and a girl, that's no big deal. And what you do sexually, it's no big deal as long as you feel fulfilled and happy about it.
And that's the thing about curriculums, right? The curriculums are catechisms, and you really need to understand that. That doesn't mean it's bad. I'm because I want to be very clear. I don't think either of us are saying catechisms are a bad thing. They're inevitable in some real way. They just simply have to be balanced by what I would call it a kind of an embodied communities, right? But because what happened in my church is that after the councils, there was all kinds of confusion, right? And so finally, John Paul II commissions the writing of a new catechism. And so when I was in college, the Catechism of the Catholic Church was printed and promulgated, and all of a sudden, overnight, all of this kind of stuff that had been passed on to students and families as, well, Catholics can now believe X, Y, and Z. All of a sudden, that gets like, wait, what? Because that's not what the catechism say. So that like ticked off all of the, I would say, the progressive element in the church, because they loved not having an explicit catechism because they could just be the catechism, right? And so that fight, John Paul II sort of put a stopper in some way, shape, or form on that. Of course, there's a whole story afterwards, but there's something unsatisfying about a catechism that's just a catechism, right? If the catechism doesn't come out of the lived experience of a community, whatever you want to call this, right? If a catechism isn't a sort of a natural outgrowth of worship and culture, then then it's like it's alien, and
Yeah.
therefore it's going to be perceived by a certain segment of your population as colonial.
Yep. Yep. And we asked before, okay, how does the gospel get transmitted if you don't have a catechism?
Mhm.
Well, and the same with the urban monoculture. How does the urban monoculture get transmitted if you keep your catechism implicit? In a sense, it's a little easier because, especially depending on what exactly your gospel is,
Yeah.
you can keep tinkering with it as you go. And
Mhm.
because of basically the perpetual amnesia of successive generations and
Yeah.
human beings,
Yeah.
you can very quickly forget that, oh, yeah. And so then suddenly you read an old book. So one of the things that's happening, of course, in public education now is, how do you teach students in California history? In the fourth grade, all California students are required to take California history. California history is enormously fraught
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because you've got the missions.
Yeah. Right.
And
And so they go from being these beacons of civilization and light to these sources of incarceration and oppression, and white supremacy.
right. And now
Like overnight.
right. And,
Overnight.
and and now you have to get rid of all of the books that, of course, have the catechisms of the previous generations. You got to get rid of those. But now they've got sort of a weird dual system where on one hand, there's this implicit catechism in the culture that says, don't expect the heirs of oppression to educate the heirs of the colonialists,
That's right.
because don't put that burden on them. Okay.
Don't make me do the work. Yeah, I know.
Don't make me
I'm
do the
familiar.
work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So, and don't let anybody who's not from that group write a book to educate the heirs of the oppressors in that. Okay. So, you know what's happening now? There are no
Nothing.
books.
Nothing. Yeah,
There are
exactly.
no books, which
Yeah.
means that, fourth grade, every year, another class goes through fourth grade, which means you're going to have generations of people that are going to be like, what's the
Well,
history of California?
right. So it's elective amnesia, and what that's really perilous territory.
We're
Because
all concerned.
right, exactly, exactly, and you know, a lot of what animates my attraction to the corner has been, well, I mean, what first got your attention, the way I first got your attention was that I wrote a piece basically bemoaning the fact that the cultural transmission of my particular church was not passed on to me. Right now, you can that becomes a pattern then for the way that I see the world, and I hold on, I
Keep
hold to
talking. I got
that.
to fill my drink. Keep
Yeah,
talking.
and I hold to that, right? But but what I found out as a young adult who started to do a deep read into my own tradition is that, why didn't anybody ever tell me about any of this stuff? Like, this is great stuff. Like, what has gone wrong? Why wasn't I given my inheritance? Right. And so therefore, if it's true in this way, it was also true in terms of, like an English class, or a film class, or a culture class, that all this stuff had been um withheld from me. Now, at the time, I didn't know if that was like, did somebody just forget? Or was there some kind of purpose behind this? Um, and I guess at this point, I think it was probably on purpose in a very real way. Like, in other words, there were those who had been tasked to mind the vineyard
Right.
had pillaged it.
Right.
And when the son came back, to see what was up, they killed him. Right. I mean,
And
that's the
no,
pattern.
that's right. That's right. And what's so interesting is because I'm a bit older than you, and
Mhm.
I think it's again these people born late boomers, early Xers
Yeah.
that saw enough of the old world.
Yeah.
And of course, the old world and the new world sort of had this urban rural dynamic too. So if you wanted to go visit the old world, you could still find it when I was young. Even when I was in college, you could
Well,
still
yeah.
find the old
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, I mean, look at our friend Rod. I mean, Rod's a perfect he was just writing about this, I think today or yesterday. He was just talking about the fact that he grew up in this weird rural world, but then would have had urban experience, and then would go back to the real world,
Yeah.
sort of the rural world, and then go back to the urban. So he's a classic liminal figure, and I think that's really what you're talking about here, Paul,
Yep.
is that that you all are occupying this liminal space, enough of the old and right there in the midst of the new, that you can kind of do this flip back and forth.
Yep.
And I would put myself at the tail end of that too,
Yeah.
because I grew up in the South, and I think there was still some vestiges
Yep.
of certainly there was a residual Catholic piety that still existed in the world I grew up in, but also there was a sort of a residual culture that was still in it being maintained. It did not get run through, but you know I would run to the mailbox once a month to receive the oracle from Rolling Stone magazine that would take me out of my sorry, sad little backward southern town, and I could dream about New York or LA or Paris or London, and I did, right? And so that allure got me for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see it. I can see it. And there are, as with Erie and Reformations, I mean, there's all these aspects to this layer because, of course, getting television. I mean, now, I mean, you can get some of it in print, but boy, I mean, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, the evolution of television and how those things played out culturally, politically, religiously was absolutely key.
Yeah,
Same thing with the lunar. I mean, can you imagine if there had been a television crew with Columbus
right,
coming into the New
right.
World? But now we imagine this. But again, one of the things that we've been, of course, mining in this little corner and seeing now in our conversations with respect to psychology and cognitive science, if you read enough, if you read enough from ancient material, you begin to appreciate the fact that in deep ways, they just saw the world differently.
Yeah,
And we have an appreciation for that. Of course, Tom Holland has been the, proponent of that because his story is about he begins to appreciate how radically different his heroes saw the world from himself, which meant that he could never be that kind of hero, which would mean
yeah,
that you
yeah.
go on a quest for looking, what kind of hero can I
Can
be,
I be?
especially if you're a man.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that I wonder if I was reading up on some McIntyre this morning, in his book After Virtue, and he's sort of doing a similar kind of project. It's not really a retrieval project, but it's a sort of a recognition, that. that the way we talk about these things is in some ways really context dependent. So therefore, what is the underneath that could possibly connect these things? Because we no longer talk the same way.
Right.
So what does remain?
Yes.
And so I know, for me, the urban monoculture oracle, say, of the Rolling Stone magazine, and that cluster of that worldview, both through the music and the music videos of MTV and that whole ethos, that disconnected me radically from everything that had come before. But what reconnected me was, you know, a good teacher reading a really old book and letting the really old book speak to me on its own terms.
Yeah.
But I had a
Yeah.
true professor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's not unlike a good witness to the gospel, right?
Yeah.
That's what's so interesting to me.
Yeah.
So I remember, when he said, and so therefore I know that the in the, this vast body of wisdom that Set has disconnected us from, and that the urban monoculture has disconnected us from. I know that holds. It's almost it's exactly what we need. It has in it somehow, and it's what we need. But it's not just like jug mug, right?
Yeah.
There's something about actually wrestling with the material, right?
Yeah.
As a practice, right? That So it's not just like okay, I now know A, B, and C, right? As if I just sort of downloaded it off a website. It's okay, A, B, C, done. No, there's something about doing it, right? There's something about, fighting with, I don't know, Macbeth, or fighting with the Confessions, like really trying to understand it. Um, I could, we could go and chat GPT right now and we could say, what are the top 10 lessons from St. Augustine's Confessions? And it would spit us out probably a pretty good list,
Yeah.
right? And okay, but that's not the thing.
Right.
So it goes back to this catechism question,
Right.
right? That here, if you just like, if I just eat the catechism,
Right.
like I'll be fine.
Right.
It's not, right. It's reconnecting to a process and a pool or something. I don't know.
I think it has to do with idolatry,
Oh,
in that there was an idolatry around in the Christian Reformed Church. I mean, the Christian Reformed Church that was dying when I was coming up was deeply built around the Heidelberg Catechism.
okay.
As a youth, you memorized it in midweek class, and as Nancy Schuler said, you were graded on it.
Yeah,
To
yeah,
become a member of the church, you went to a council meeting, and you would have to be able to recite on command elements of the catechism. That doesn't mean if you did poorly, you necessarily would not be allowed in, but
I
that was
follow.
the system.
Yeah, I follow. I follow.
Every Sunday night, the catechism is broken down into 52 Lord's Days. It doesn't matter Christmas, Easter,
Yeah,
Lenten.
yeah,
I mean, all of
yeah.
this Lenten, the
Well, that's all. I
liturgical
mean,
calendar.
these are all papish accretions. I mean, come on,
Exactly, exactly.
yeah, yeah.
So
Which I always
52.
chuckle about. I always chuckle about, with my Protestant friends. They're talking about Lent and they're talking about Christmas. I'm like, man, if you really want to do a dive there, you would not be sitting too well with Sir Calvin. Let me tell you. Luther
So,
might have a
so,
couple of choice things to say to you right now. So,
but part of the, I think part of the deconstruction of all of that entire system in the Christian Reformed Church
mhm.
was, again, by virtue of, let's say, the civil rights movement, because when it was so when the racism and the treatment of African Americans was just so blatantly obvious, you provoked questions about if our catechism, if our discipline and practice of the catechism is so right, how could we have missed that? And so then then you sort of have how an idol gets exposed.
Mhm.
And now suddenly, and then of course in that iconoclastic moment, let's destroy that idol and get rid of it, when no, actually, maybe the problem wasn't necessarily the catechism. And at least in our system, confessions are not scripture. I mean, they're a step below the canon. They
Mhm.
can be, they're within reach of us.
Yeah.
But and I think along the lines in many of these siloed traditions, part of what pluralism exposed in a good way were some of the idols that we held. But now we have the difficulty of, again, going back to formation. And so the comments that I made on Twitter this morning, and then I made a little membership video on my cell phone, was watching these new trad movements. Now, in the Roman Catholic Church, just because it's so massive, you can
Yeah.
have a significant movement like the trads, and there's just one tiny piece of the massive thing. But in terms of the Orthodox in America, this trad movement, it's probably going to take over the whole thing. I
Mhm.
mean, just by virtue of scale, or it could.
Mhm.
Or if in fact the immigrant churches are dying and the
Mhm.
trads are coming up, they're going to inherit, they're going to
But
inherit the structures and the buildings.
yeah, but these you're right, exactly. I mean, these are the ebbs and flows of awakenings and fallings away. And this is Old Testament 101, right? I mean, this is what we do. Um, and it's and I'm sympathetic to it, but my concern is that, and again, this is why I'm here and not, you know, preaching on word on fire, let's say, is that I do not believe it. I don't think it's what's gonna work.
Right. I think
And
that's what's unique about the corner,
right,
in
right,
that,
right.
we're not, I'm very much, God bless the traditional Catholic, God
Mhm.
bless the
Yeah, yeah,
Orthodox, God.
yeah.
And also then we're going to sit in an estuary meeting with a bunch of people like John Van Donk, who, is very much with us in many ways, but he's got doubts. He's got skepticism.
Mhm,
He's got his own little idols that he loves. I mean, even
mhm.
at our church estuary yesterday, I was going to say, John, you don't have to sell estuary here. We're all here.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, I think to me, it's a very understandable response to what you always talk about with combinatorial explosiveness, right? That in eras in which things are in flux and in doubt, and there's more information that you can possibly wrap your head around it. We're looking for certain technologies that will simplify the game, right? I call these sort of cultural jigs, right? Because you need a workaround. You need or a workaround is the wrong way. You need something to manage your workflow.
Right. You
Um,
need a compression engine. You
that's
need
right.
something to
Yeah,
take too much and to say,
that's
okay,
right.
I can't manage the whole thing, so I'll do
That's right.
this
Right.
because I've
So
got
so
confidence in this.
yeah, and so therefore I am sympathetic to the trad, all the varieties of trad, right? Because it is at least a recognition that something's wrong, right? It's at least a recognition that the thin gruel that we were served is not up to the task, and so therefore it's time to get serious about it. And so you're seeing this with the Orthodox, of course, are the envy of the trad world because they do Lent for real, those kinds of things. And I get it. I do. I understand that, but it will, and of course, the tell will be time, right?
Yes.
Will you be able to replicate and pass on to a successive generation or two? And really, what every sort of trad bro who's on Twitter flaming all the liberals and all the lefties, etc., what they should be worried about is their grandchildren. Don't worry about me. I'm old. Like whatever. Like I'm doing whatever I'm doing. You need to be worried about your grandchildren, because that's the only way it 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 means anything. Because everybody can, That's
Everybody
why,
can pose.
right, right. No, no,
You
no,
can,
that's exactly right. I mean, everybody can, start up a commune.
well,
No,
and well, not even start up a commune. That's what they did in the
mm,
60s and 70s. All you need is to order an icon
yeah,
on Orthodox Amazon.
that's right. That's right.
You just
Monastery
gotta
icons.
get your Peugeot fairy tale
Yeah,
and
yeah,
do some
yeah,
profilicity, on Twitter with it.
yeah, yeah. No, and boy, and that's my worry, right? As an older guy, I remember how, fired up I was when I was 23 and thought that everybody was an idiot and, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it was a little bit different because when I was 23, you had somebody as inspiring as John Paul II, on the throne of Peter. And so I could just sort of point right there.
Yeah,
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 like scoreboard, look what we got. This is a rock
yeah.
star here. And, for those of us who did not predecease the rock star, we understand that when the rock star leaves town, there's something really sad about the cleanup. And again,
Mm.
no shade on. I'm a big fan. I remain a big fan, even with certain asterisks about John Paul II. I love him, and he is a hero of mine. But the church. Well, I mean, look at the church now, right? I mean, it's a bed of confusion. So therefore, being able to fast better than your neighbor more severely, you know, ain't gonna do it. You know, it's because you're just a different flavor of
Right,
productivity, bro.
right.
You
And
know,
when we and then you look at analogs all through the Protestant world as well. I mean, okay, I'm gonna homeschool my kids all the
right?
way through their bachelor's degree. And they are only gonna watch
Yeah,
what
right,
I allow them to watch on any
right,
screen.
right,
And they are going to memorize they are going to memorize The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe so they can quote Lewis and Tolkien at the drop of, I mean,
yeah.
whatever
That's right.
system you
That's right.
want. Part of what when I, of course, my vocation requires that I spend time reading the Gospels and thinking about the Gospels and thinking about how I can, again, this transposition that Lewis writes about, how I can sort of, preaching is between two worlds. So, okay, how can I, within 25 or 30 minutes, give especially now on the YouTube thing, give a diversity of people a glimpse, a little bit of that something
Mm,
that is the gospel through the gospels. And one of the things that I regularly come to in the gospels is that this dispensation, this age of decay that we live on, only so much can be achieved here.
mhm.
And that
Yeah.
and now I might be underestimating, I might be a pessimist, overly pessimistic, who knows. Please prove my pessimism wrong.
That's
Nothing would make me
that's right.
happier.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
But over time we see, the Protestants, okay, we're gonna, now that we're now that we've, we now that we're away from the French king, now that we're out of his, now we're just on the border in Geneva, a whole bunch of French exiles clustered into this town. Now finally we're gonna do it right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
no one ever does.
no, and look, this is the going back to the Columbus bit. We talked about the Gutenberg and the Columbus thing. Imagine what it would be like to be Calvin. Let's just use, and again, I don't, full disclosure, you know a heck of a lot more about Calvin than I do, but I'm just
As
putting
I
myself,
should.
yeah, right, as a Calvinist, right? No, but I mean, like, if memory serves, he would, he was born a French Catholic, right?
Yes, yes.
And then, right, okay, good. That's okay. So imagine,
Got his education because of all these ways of getting money and the Catholic structure and
yeah,
hierarchy.
yeah, right, 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 right. Right. So, so imagine looking at this sea of embedded um, uh, corruption, of which you cannot even see the bottom of. Like you could, move things to the side, to the side, to the side all day long and never get to the
Right.
bottom of that
Imagine
corruption.
Joe Biden
Yeah.
naming
Yeah.
archbishops and
Right.
bishops
Right.
and clergy in America. Think
Yeah.
about that, folks.
Yeah. Right. Right. So good. Right. Okay. You know, so, and then you hear this crazy story. So the world that you live in is nearly totally corrupt. There's not a parcel of land that isn't touched by someone with dirty hands. And you hear this story because it can only be a story. It's not a picture, it's not a film, it's not even a book yet. But you get a story about a whole half of a globe that you didn't know existed. Now, as far as I know, Calvin didn't have any pretensions about going to the New World. Is that fair? Okay, good. All right. But it doesn't matter. Imagine the idea that there's a place where you could start over. Good Lord. Good Lord.
Yeah, well, Mars. I mean,
Right. So we, right. No, I mean, that's where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
So, Eric Weinstein and always his talk like we got to leave the planet, and clearly Elon Musk seems invested in trying to get us to leave the planet. I get all that. Not my thing, but I get all that. The idea that all it needs is the idea that there's a place that you can go that you can start fresh. All of a sudden, you've just opened up worlds of possibilities that a generation before you would have no access to. By the frame itself, they
Yep.
would have no access to.
Yep.
That's world changing right there.
Well, and also consider, why is it that all of these reformers, and a good many who stayed in the church itself,
Yeah.
adopt Latin names?
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, yeah.
And because a whole nother world had just opened up to them.
The classics by
That's
way
right.
of Latin and really Greek. Right.
That's
No,
right.
it's exactly right.
And
Yeah,
and now it's affordable to them. They
that's right.
They
That's
don't
right.
have
That's right.
screens.
Right.
Now they can actually read it.
I've got an app for that. It's called a book.
and
Right.
and now suddenly they're living in this world of corruption, and now that they're imagining, they're setting up Tom Holland here. They're imagining this world of Cicero and Seneca
That's right.
and then Virgil and this entire world that is this world of heroes and purity,
Mhm.
and then they're uncovering these. Rome was, I'm reading these biographies of Jerusalem too, and I don't
Yeah.
know, there's got to be some good biographies of Rome out there, because just the story of the history of Rome. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
the thing was basically abandoned and
Yeah.
forgotten, and and one of the things that caught my attention too when I listened to Tom Holland was, Hadrian's Wall. Why is Hadrian's Wall the way it is? Because everybody needed material, and
Yeah.
why, dress your own stone when you just take it right
Take
off
it.
all
Yeah.
the old
Yeah.
buildings?
Right. Right. I mean, yeah, no, it's exactly right. That's exactly right. God, that's so good. That's so good. Um, so therefore, here we are,
That's
right?
right.
Okay, so we stand on, clearly we're living through an evocative liminal period.
And it's funny because the trads on one hand are, especially the ortho trads, and I imagine the Roman Catholic trads, and
Mhm.
now our recession of modernity, they would say, oh, gosh, the darn Protestant Reformation. But
Yeah,
in
yeah,
many
yeah.
ways, if you're wearing medieval clothing and taking on a church name, this is exactly what the reformers did, because
Right.
they also
Yeah,
wanted to get
yeah.
beyond
So
the world of corruption back to
so
that pure
right.
world of the New Testament.
Yeah, so Paul, this is why I know I say it all the time. We're all Protestants, right? I mean, this is exactly what I mean by that. Now you can say, or I also say we're all heretics, right? That's what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
right? Is that, you're not really being trad, you're really being, in a weird sort of way, a kind of retro progressive,
Yeah.
right? It's and it and I just don't know how, I don't know if they're capable of developing that kind of detached standpoint with which they can look at that. So again, so what I'm worried about with my own students is, how can I get them to affect both a detached and deeply engaged standpoint
Yeah.
to see the world
Yeah.
that's the thing. That's
But
what I get.
I think we go all the way back to where we started about the catechism, which is, Kale, you can only give them what you have.
Mm,
And what you have is you. And I think
mm,
that's really what's at the heart of this corner in
mm,
terms of this personalism, that and you won't hit every student,
right,
but you will be communicating something to your students just by who you are and how you love,
mm, mm,
that will get into them. And part of, I mean, the strangeness of this little corner is that this is what's happening. I mean, obviously something of me is in the corner,
right,
along with
right.
Vervaeke and Peterson and
Sure,
Peugeot
sure.
and you and Grizz, and
Mhm.
something of each of us is getting it, and Chad the alcoholic,
Right,
something of each of us is getting inside of us.
right.
And so, you are the defense against the dark arts professor.
And I've lasted more than 1 year, so that's good, I guess. Well, well, I look, not trying to toot my own horn. I think that's right. Like, I think I'm realizing that I have kind of functioned that way, as a kind of defense against the dark art teacher. But maybe this is my own ego. I don't think it is, but I want to find a way to give more of that,
Yeah.
right? You know, you know, it's and I'm coming to the realization that there's really little difference between what we're trying to do and what, in my own tradition, we would have just called, you have to be a saint.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I tweeted this out the other day. I was listening to Reformations, and I come across this guy, Gian Matteo Ghiberti, which was one of these pre-Reformation Catholic reformers. So he's a man working the system. He's in the mainstream system, and it's deeply corrupt. And he inherits a bishopric in Verona, and after getting burned in Rome, he retreats back to Verona and takes it upon himself. Is like, well, Rome's dead to me, essentially, right? As
Yep.
far as a career trajectory is concerned. So I'm going to go back to my home diocese and I'm going to be a saint. And he says this, he's talking about being a priest, but I think you can understand what I'm
Yep.
going at. He says this, mindful of our name and profession, we have the need to live well and have not gained a license to do wrong.
Hmm.
We must do this lest we give laymen any pretext to sin, or
Hmm.
cause them rightly to have a low opinion of the clergy and derive therefrom an excuse to persevere in their faults. Therefore, we must make special effort to do the works of the saints and to make our deeds shine in the presence of men, and to be watchful and solicitous of that evangelical salt in our ministry, planting, weeding, and scattering, and with the greatest zeal, building up what makes for holiness.
Hmm.
And you could do a very quick, just change out a couple of the nouns. I like I feel that, right? How many times have I jumped on a live stream with you or with Chad or with Neil and others, and everybody sort of talks about the character of the conversation. Pajot might call it the spirit of the conversation,
The angel
and
of the
this
conversation.
right. And so the angel of this corner,
Yeah.
the angel of this conversation, you know, seems to inform the way in which we talk and interact with one another,
Yeah.
right? So that, on paper, you and I might have all kinds of reasons to draw the sword, let's say, or other people, right?
Yeah.
But like in this, it doesn't matter, because what we have stumbled upon, I believe, is the greater value, right? Since we don't have to fight over, you know, land in Sacramento. I don't have to fight you about who's going to go to your church or my classroom on Wednesday or whatever, right? We're not having these sort of turf battles because we don't live in turf. We live in
Yeah.
we're in this sort of this liminal space right here.
Yeah.
It allows and affords something characteristically different.
Yeah. 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 I think that's right. And one of the things that came out, I played it on the Friday live stream, that conversation that Chad and Grizz and Lance did with Clara. When Chad and Lance and Grizz had to sort of, okay, I mean, when someone new comes in from the outside who is an academic asking questions, what's going on here? How would you describe this? You have to sort of, again, distill and compress, and some of what they noted, how many of us here are exiles in some ways from our seats of power. I am not the pastor of a important congregation in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And I'll never be a headmaster.
No. But we are all in some ways exiles. And so the paths to the ascending heights of our own particular hierarchies are closed to us for one reason or another. And I think probably some of what that forced on us is we've got little to lose. I mean,
That's right.
I can talk unfiltered on the internet as a Christian Reformed minister. And if someone decides to go after me, it'd be like, is it really worth it?
Right. What's the point?
What's the point?
Yeah. No, it's like weird. Same.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
But in these spaces, I mean, what you just read is, I think true, in that there's always this duality where, again, it's right there in the Gospels, where in many ways the heights of many of the structures, that's of course where the corruption is, because there'd be no reason. I mean, no reason corrupting anything down here. There's just not a lot to take.
Because that's where the resources are, right? I mean, it's like there's a reason why the fox goes to the hen house, because there's protein there.
That's right.
Little sacks of walking protein. Of course the foxes are going to go there, you idiot. It's like, you don't have to worry about it, sorry.
But yet in some ways, the gospel is here because the gospel is here, and we can enjoy, it in some ways because, we don't have a concentration of hens here. And that's part of why
these are not the hens you're looking for.
That's right. But that's part of why, again, I have this, and I'm critiqued and sometimes rightly criticized for it, this belief in the small and the slow. Because you and I can do this because we can do this. And if I had a channel the size of Jordan Peterson or even Jonathan Peugeot, I mean, it's harder and harder to get time with John and Jonathan, and rightly so. They're significant men who are doing significant things, and they're in demand, and I'm glad they're in demand because they're doing important work, and God bless them. But I love living in a world where, if you make your way here Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, you can sit in a room with me and 6 other people, and we can have a conversation. And because there's something really beautiful about that. And, I think about, Luke, I think it's Luke 12. Basically Jesus says, be of good cheer, little flock. Because, basically I'm giving it to you. The kingdom of heaven is accessible all around you. I mean, the kingdom of heaven isn't the kingdom of heaven isn't behind a paywall. The kingdom of heaven isn't at the front of an enormous line that you don't have time or life or money or leisure to wait in. The kingdom of heaven is at hand, and is at hand for any of us. I mean, that's the amazing thing about the kingdom of heaven, that it is, again, I have, someone made a great meme of it. They have the two lines, the line of people waiting to be loved, and then the line where you can go to love. And there's no line on that door. There's no line at that desk.
Right.
You have people around you right now who need to be loved, and you can love them. And that's where it starts. So I don't know.
And I hope that, I do think that is part of the animating spirit behind, Peterson's very pedestrian seeming advice slash admonishment to young men, that 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 the best way to get meaning is, let's say, is to orient your life around giving it.
Yeah.
And that's why young men respond to being a father.
Yeah.
It's like it takes all of the guesswork out of it. It's like, well, mama and child are right there. Get to it. You know, but again, so maybe my concern here is that, you know, the rich man needs the gospel too. And I'm not trying to make some sort of like Joel Osteen type,
Yeah.
Argument here.
Yeah.
In other words, you know, perhaps actually and metaphorically, the students that God has seen fit to put in front of me are rich men,
Yeah.
as the parable goes,
Yeah.
right? And they're in need of the gospel too.
Yeah.
And it just, the thought of them, sort of going out into that world, and just before they even have a chance to notice, they've been like, a spell has been cast upon them.
Yeah.
And I might even mean that actually,
Yeah.
of again, functionalist, nihilistic,
Yeah.
materialistic, that gets me,
Yeah.
that not only for the world, but like for them, like for them, um that they will, like, I'm not sure if they understand what they're sacrificing,
Yeah.
and so that.
Well, we both, I mean, when I look at, I mean, I think we both have been there. And I think in many ways, those who are exiles from that, hopefully by the grace of God, learn and find another path. Um,
Oh
it's,
yeah, yeah. It's not written,
yeah.
to riff on, what's the name of that movie? The desert movie, Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence
Like,
of Arabia.
it's not written. I believe that. I wouldn't get up. I wouldn't get up every day.
No, no.
If I believed that it was written. But um, but it would be, but you don't have to wait either, right?
No, I know, I know, I know. Well, one of the things that I note is that, and this goes far beyond um, the particular structures and spells and principalities of our age and our place and our moment, that it is almost always the case that saints are made in suffering. Saints are something. The idols have to be exposed and broken before you, and those dreams have to be broken before you're actually ready to receive. And it's, it's so
Right.
interesting. If you
Right.
look at Peter, I'm so interested in this book that you told me about. I'm going to look at it's
Right.
another book in the pile.
Right.
But it's only 99 cents on Kindle.
Yeah.
But you look at Peter, I think it was you last time we talked about Peter and Judas. There's
Yeah.
also Peter and the rich young ruler.
Mm,
And this last
mm,
time that I preached through it again, part of the
mm.
beauty about returning to these texts
Yeah.
again and
Yeah.
again
Exactly.
is, and in different gospels, is that, of course, Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler, and Peter, I think, sees in Jesus' face that Jesus loves this young man. And you
Yeah.
can just see this
Yeah.
young man,
Yeah.
he's a good guy. All of Moses, I've done that.
I'm there. I'm there. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
there. I've done Moses. I'm a trad,
Yeah.
I really believe in Moses. I believe in the historical Moses, and
Mhm.
I believe in the covenant, and I'm fulfilling the covenant because I want to see God's kingdom come. And so I've fulfilled the covenant. What's left, Jesus? And Jesus says,
Eh,
well, get rid of everything and
everything.
just
Yeah.
join my troop. Of course, the Gadarene demoniac doesn't get to join Jesus' troop.
Right.
Again and again, Jesus liberates people and they
Says
don't get to
stay.
join his
Stay.
troop.
Yeah.
Here, Jesus comes and says,
Here.
you, I
Oh.
want you. And Peter
Yeah.
then maybe gets, I'm old, I'm not wealthy, I maybe this guy's more attractive to Jesus than me, and maybe my post of preeminence is now threatened by this rich young ruler.
Mm,
And of course, the rich young ruler doesn't take the invite. And then
yeah.
Peter launches in and says, "But Jesus, we've left everything to follow
Everything.
you.
Yeah.
And what are you afraid of here, Pete? What are you afraid of?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Jesus, of course, says what he says. And it's like, ooh.
Devastation. Devastation.
You'll not only receive in this life, but in the age to come. And it's like, okay, then back to Peter. What did Peter receive in exchange for his desire to leave you know, his fishing business and become a disciple of Jesus? What did that cost Peter, and what did he receive in return?
Yeah.
I mean, he just let's see. Jesus says, "You receive all these things and persecutions." It's like,
Right. Is that on the
persecutions?
list? Yeah.
No, 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 no. I
Yeah.
like my discipleship without persecutions.
That's right.
Thank you.
That's right. I could just stay here. I'm good here. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I don't, you don't, we never excel beyond our master. We don't.
Yeah.
Even though greater things he will do something, he will do greater things through us than perhaps what others had seen in terms of those things. But we don't excel beyond our master.
Yeah. That's right.
Anyway, well, maybe it's time to land the plane, Kale.
Yeah, indeed. No, this is awesome as always.
This
Yeah.
has been great. This has been great. I'll put this in no wait, no ads. And then if you want to, I don't know if you want to post it to your channel or if you want to wait or what your desires. I don't know what the
Yeah, if you don't
status of your
mind,
project
yeah,
is.
I'd love to post it. Yeah, if you don't mind, you go first. I mean, I'm not trying to get subs just yet, so I'm just putting
Well,
stuff up.
I'm going to put it in no wait, no ads because I want to
Great.
do a little bit of work on Peterson's Bishop Barron conversation this afternoon, and I'll
Yeah,
probably
excellent.
post that tomorrow. So
Great.
then, I'm sure the corner people that are in the membership section will chew on this for a little bit,
Love it. That's great.
and
That's great.
so, but
Awesome.
I will send you a copy of it too.
All right, thanks, Paul.
All right, Kale. Well, let me pray for you. I want to
Oh,
pray
thank
for
you.
you.
Yeah.
Lord, as you said to Elijah, as you said to Paul, you have people that we don't see all around us because we can only see through the hierarchies that afford the distance vision that mountains afford. And Lord, it is just a delight this morning to spend some time with Kale and to compare notes about our own stories and our own churches and how you've worked in the Catholic Church and how you've worked in the Christian Reformed Church, and the upsides and the downsides and the idolatries and the failures and the insights and all the ups and downs. And Lord, this is your kingdom and these are your churches, and Lord, you're working through all of this. And so, Lord, I thank you for Kale, and I thank you for his students. And Lord, his students are richly blessed to have him. And I pray, Lord, that you continue to bless him and that you continue to work through him. And may he continue to be the professor of the defense against the dark arts, wherever you place him in teaching Dante and Virgil and classics. And I thank you, Lord, that there still are schools that that want their students to know this work. And I thank you, Lord, that you continue to work in surprising ways through people that perhaps 2-3 generations from now here on earth, their names will not be remembered, but Lord, you remember, you don't forget. So I pray, Lord, that you bless him, that you keep him, and you cause all that he puts his hand to flourish. So hear my prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Paul.
All right, Cal, take care.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.